Thank you so much for joining us today again this is our second session of Positions, which is convened by the Department of Architecture at the GSD. Andrew Holder and I have conceived Positions as a series of conversations not only to share the discourse from within our school, but also to occasion a broader reflection on the varied positions taken by players on the field of contemporary architecture. That is, to unfold the complexities of relations to make them explicit. So we are inviting faculty and guests to voice where they stand and what's on their mind. The participants in this series will be drawn from all facets of the discipline: practicing architects, designers, historians, scholars, theorists, technologists, and those in allied fields of design. So please stay tuned as we get the series underway. Today is my distinct pleasure to briefly introduce a trio of speakers and to take on the challenge of condensing their incredible and impressive backgrounds into 2 minutes. We're really lucky to have Clover Lee Victor Jones and Vittorio Lampugnani.
Wow.
Getting that good. Teaching with us here this semester. Clover is the founder and director of Plus Clover, established in the US in 2001 and practicing from Hong Kong since 2009. Her practice has completed a wide array of projects, including Playscape, a large-scale installation of the Admiralty MTR station, as well as a series of materially and structurally intensive retail and dwelling environments with a keen eye toward the play of light, texture, and sensuality. Clover received her B.Arch from Cornell and MDes from Harvard. She's taught at Rice, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, UCLA, and USC, as well as holding visiting positions at the University of Michigan and the University of Hong Kong. This semester, she's teaching this studio with Victor Jones entitled From Within to Without. Victor is a principal and founding partner of LA-based Fievre Jones. His practice frames questions of environmental equity through work that explores the impact of infrastructure on underserved communities. Projects include a proposal for art-based support facilities near the NOAA Purifoy Outdoor Desert Art Museum, programmatic amenities for the organization Watts House Project, and artist studios and residences at the Tekrima Center for the Arts in New Orleans. Victor received his M.Arch from the Harvard GSD and B.Arch from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. He serves as the graduate director at Cal Poly Pomona. He's a frequent guest critic here at the GSD, as well as at the Little School in New Jersey and the tech school down the street. Vittorio has led studio. That's not nice, I know. Vittorio has led I couldn't resist, Architektur in Milan since 1981 and Baukontur Architekten in Zurich since 2010. In his writing, teaching, and practice, Vittorio advocates for architectural and urban sustainability through a range of projects, such as the Novartis campus in Basel to the Richti urban quarter and office building in Zurich. He played a seminal role in the International Building Exhibition in Berlin while serving as a member of the editorial board of the Italian magazine Casabella. He later served as chief editor of Domus magazine and as the director of the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt. From 1994 until 2016, Vittorio held the chair for History of Urban Design at ETH Zurich. He is teaching with us the GSD Option Studio entitled Transforming the Urban Villa with Private Garden into a Contemporary Typology. You can also catch a lecture that he delivered with the GSD in 2021 at the invitation by our Rahul Malhotra. So thank you, all three of you, for joining. Since we need to keep a pace, I have been told that I am the flag lady, but I've also been told that Andrew Holder has given very explicit instructions as to the unfolding. So we're going to see how this timing works out. Thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming these three.
You start. Age before beauty. Beauty is him. Beauty is him. Yes.
About beauty, there are no doubts. Thank you so much for. Is it okay? Is it working? Yes. For the invitation to this rather complex, intricate, and fascinating format. yes, I'm very happy to have this this occasion. So thank you so much. So we were told a lot of things. We were told to start with our past. I think we agreed. I think, did we agree? We agreed to concentrate a little bit on architectural language because I think it's an important topic, and it's also a topic that I have not resolved for myself. Really, so I hope to be able to resolve it in the discussion afterwards. That's my egoistical attitude. So my past is of course quite long. I'm autonomous. Okay, so this is the past. My past is I studied at 2 universities, Rome and Stuttgart. Was pretty unhappy with the universities, not in general, and did not start to design at all because I was really very confused and started to look more at history, and in history I found a few heroes that appealed to me. One is Adolf Loos. I show you very briefly the house that you know, the Haus Müller in Prague. I was fascinated by, let's say, by the complexity that he could display in the interiors, but let's say hidden in a core of utmost simplicity, almost of subdued expression, and this contrast between the outside and very lush inside with incredible materials, with incredible spaces, I found extremely appealing and interesting. I found also interesting the transformations that his doctrine had in houses like Casa la Meridiana in Milan. By Definiti was a student of Loos, and I was fascinated by this, by seeing that modern architecture did not need to express its modernity like a manifesto, but could blend in the city fabric, like in this very beautiful house, could use, let's say, traditional elements like corniche, like a sundial that was done by Definiti's friend Gigliotti Zanini, very interesting person, and still could have this interesting and complex and very well done floor plans. This is just an image of that, and maybe what, let's say, the project and also the person to whom I owe most is Giorgio Grassi. I show just one project, the Casa dello Studente in Chieti, which I did together with Monestiroli, very simple, structured student housing, very, as you can see, very strict, very rational. These are the floor plans. And this is the most famous, I think, rendering. It has been built, but I don't show it how it was built because it was not built well. I think this image is much stronger. And from him, I never was a student. I never worked with him. We had just a very intense connection. And from him, I learned a lot of things that have really, let's say, helped me in my search for an architectural language. One thing is that architectural language should be very rational, so it should stem from function and from construction, but also that it should be linked with history. That the history, and all history, not just the history of modern times, but all history would be the basis of an architectural language. And of course, you can see that this owes a lot to Weinbrenner's famous arcades, and I learned also that architecture should not look for novelty for its own sake, but could be, something very relaxed and something that should strive. This is very difficult to do, for timelessness, to be linked to a certain time and a certain fashion. And what I then added a little bit to it was, for me, the obligation towards the city, the obligation towards the public spaces of the city, which in some way does not allow to do everything in architecture, but means to let's say, to restrict oneself to the very essential elements, and also to be attentive to the context, which is not a contextualism, but let's say a very difficult balance between the autonomy of architecture, which maybe we can talk later, and it's that has nothing to do with the autonomy of architecture taught by, I don't know, Peter Eisenman, and it's, let's say, it's obligation somehow to blend into the context. I think my 5 minutes are gone.
To further complicate things, I'm going to start by explaining a little bit the format that we're going to use between Clover and myself. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Grace and Andrew for inviting us to participate in this new series of conversations. It's a great honor to be here. But I will present the past, Clover the present, and together she and I will present the future. I think it's also a good opportunity to talk about the white elephant in the room, which is the things that bring us together as an entity. I think throughout the conversation, we will begin to expose ourselves to and touching on the loose nature of our collaborative endeavors together. And also, I think that first, that needs to be maybe stated, most importantly, is that is guided by common affinities or curiosities, more so than an well-oiled plan. Neither one of us are finding the opportunity to work together, to teach together, to fight over certain ideas, to have conversations about architecture. Although they are often rooted in theoretical constructs or clearly articulated or rational terms of engagement, they often are the inspirations of just simple curiosities or opportunities that present themselves to us both in practice and in academia. For some of you, that might seem to be something that advocates a new paradigm, fickle as the new fidelity. But for us, I would argue that embedded in our episodic exchanges is evidence of the elasticity and fluidity of 21st century practice and thought, and design language as a result. So with having said that, I will start by presenting the past and start by this slide by Bruce Nauman, which for me represents many things. And I think it's unavoidable that during the discussion of the past that one would have to talk about, in some form of therapy, the curious oscillation between now and then, but also between the idea of what it meant to Bruce Nauman, the idea of running from fear and from the rear. I also think that this idea of the past is only traceable with some reference to to the present and the future, really brings me back to my memories of being here as a student in the early 90s, 1992 and 90 through 95. And it recalls these two curious encounters that I had, and probably the most memorable experience about being at the GSD, unlike my experience at Cal Poly Pomona, was that I was confronted with two diametrically opposing set of ideas. One was the principles of descriptive geometry and Gaspard Monge, and this idea that through the teachings of Miles Ritter and Scott Cohen, where drawings that are predicated on exactitude and precision would offer multiple views and from multiple vantage points that were considered true to form of that object. In contrast, there is David Hickey, who really offered the idea that they're questioning the resilience of institutions, moralities, and biases vis-a-vis real life. And I think this came out of his own personal experiences as an art critic, starting not as in support of the museum as institution, but the life of the gallery as a place of where action happens in the art practices. And so for me, this course that I took, this elective course, David Hickey's Visuality and Culture of Architecture in Post-Euclidean West, really was, for me, in such stark contrast between those things that were being taught by Gaspard Monge, which seemed to be universal truths. Thinking back about those rich dialogues, in both of those courses, and thinking also about Dave Hickey and his very provocative but illuminating conversations that included fellow classmates such as Mark Lee, Jenny Gang, Josh Ramus, and myself, who Dave Hickey would constantly refer to as the gay Eskimo in the back of the room. So I think and I know that there's a disconcerting statement to say today, but somehow that, one, the acknowledgement of my presence was comforting, but on the other hand, very, very socially and politically sensitive in today's terms. But what it did do is it began to help me see, and I think that this is something that both Clover and I share, is that embedded in the systems, in many ways this conversation by Michel de Certeau, that embedded in the systems and the organizations that are either within the city, within our discipline, within the institutions, the academic institutions that feed thought, and in practice, there's a certain kind of opacity that presents itself initially. But in scratching the surface, one begins to discover the multitude of layers that exist within all of those realms. And so this set of drawings, which actually was, I guess, Zaha Hadid was the shaman for working through some of the kind of contradictions and kind of like variations of thought that presented themselves between these two poles of thought, between descriptive geometry and this kind of asking ourselves what post-Euclidean West and architecture and culture meant. And this is an initial analysis of Central Park. It was in many ways an emancipatory experience because it offered the opportunity to begin to understand that there were other things happening in Central Park, particularly in the Rambles, that were not recorded histories. And it was only when you read the kind of design brief for Central Park that you begin to understand that it is not perhaps accidental that certain activities occur in the Rambles. But these diagrams begin to present an opportunity to expose and document and archive many of these informal and invisible activities that take place in these public spaces. That has been the underpinnings of my pedagogy as a teacher, and understanding analysis as a creative endeavor. This is a project by a student from USC back in 1996, where the student is documenting the former area of Dogpatch in San Francisco, and looking at certain kinds of built environments that would not be traditionally part of the conversation, but that do solicit a certain degree of inspiration about tectonics, relationships, and form. I think in closure of the past, I think one of the things in the recent past, I should say, is the opportunity to articulate ideas about architecture, about its relationship to the social political landscape of our cities, of people, of institutions, and writing becoming a form of creative expression, but also of articulating one's thoughts. And if I felt a stranger in that room, and I found comfort in being identified as anyone in that room as a gay Eskimo, I think that this book began to offer a kind of more clear path towards my relationship with the discipline and the dialogue that we would pursue together.
Well, my present. What let's say the interaction with Giorgio Grassi gave to me were basically two things. One, not three things. One, a kind of common friends out of history that I had not studied in my normal classes, like Heinrich Tessenau, German, very interesting German architect, I think of the 20s and 30s, or Fernand Pouillon in France. It gave me, it gave me a different theoretical background, more oriented towards, let's say, the Marxist aesthetical theories, which were interesting to me, like George Lucas and this, let's say, this this order of people that were interesting to me because they all tried somehow to connect architectural language with a socialist system and with a direct dialogue with the public. And thirdly, and maybe most important, he gave me the courage to design, to start designing. That was the moment where I started to work as an architect, and also opened then later a very unsuccessful practice. But it helped me. Let's say it helped me especially dismiss a lot of options that exist and that I could not embrace. I could not embrace not because they are wrong or they are not interesting, but simply because they do not relate to my view of the world, to my theoretical understanding of architecture, and in some way also to my personality. I have to admit that. So there is this subjective dimension, which I try to limit as much as possible, but it's not always possible. So among the things that we as I said, the practice was remarkably unsuccessful, but still we did build some small things in Berlin and in Italy. I showed then two bigger projects. One is in the Novartis campus, which Grace kindly mentioned. We did the master plan, but I show you the red dot. We built one of the buildings in the campus. This is the floor plan. It's a ground plan. It's an office building, but with actually very good Italian restaurant and also very well designed Italian restaurant, of course, in the ground floor, and that's the upper floors. We played here, or we tried to play the Adolf Loos card, creating a very simple facade. It's made of rather thick stone, but it's very simple. It is very domestic. We wanted to do an office building that would have a kind of domestic attitude. It's not quite as simple as you may think from this photograph, but it is very very simple. In any case, it stands out by its simplicity from the row of buildings of very famous architects like Sana, Peter Merkley, or here in the front, from the first. Yes, and in front, Rafael Moneo's building. We were interested really in not standing out. Ironically, the building somehow stands out because it doesn't. But that was really not intentional. So it's really a very very simple facade. We were interested and also very much in the construction. So it's not, the stone is not applied. It's not clad in stone. The stone bears. It bears here only itself. We have changed that. I wouldn't do that today anymore, but at least it holds itself. So the facade is let's say self-bearing, but it doesn't hold the whole building. The building under and behind that there is a concrete structure, and the interior is in a slightly Losian way. It's exactly the contrary. It's very warm, very rich. It's a wooden veneer. It has a big staircase connecting all the floors of the building. There's also let's say an urban dimension to that interests me, to have a kind of main street distributing all the spaces. But that's another question. This was our first, or my first endeavor to really express what I thought I could express. The second one is, you mentioned it too, Grace, the Richti, near Zurich. It's a district, it's a kind of urban quarter. Again, we did the master plan. This was interestingly enough, or let's say surprisingly enough, a competition that we won for reasons that I still don't quite fathom, and so we could control it quite well, and we built one building, the building on the right. So it's a big perimeter block with a large garden inside it. It's all housing. So it's on the ground floor. It's restaurants, and it's very classical restaurants and shops, not in all buildings, but in most of them, and along the main street. And then it's residential. This is the main street. This is our building, and this is the facade. And I admit it's not exactly what one would say. It's a very varied facade, but that was exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to do an absolutely uniform facade. It was not that easy because the client asked us to modify, to put variety in and to change it. So we had to do mock-ups and things like that. I was interested in having a facade that is very, very straightforward, very urban. So it has an arcade as a kind of gesture towards the street and the public space. It has no balconies whatsoever because I don't like them on a main street. Because I think that an urban architecture should be towards the street very strict and not allow too much inside in its private realms. We do have balconies. Relax, we have balconies in the apartment, but on the other side, and we try to do. We have all these French windows with shutters. I mean, doing a shutter in Switzerland is really something. I'm really proud of, because they don't know shutters and they didn't want them, and they want to put motors in them, and because it's impossible to open it. Nobody will ever open it. It works quite nicely. It's very simple. We had to have them made for this building, but it has so many windows that it doesn't matter. And what I like about this facade is that the variety happens because people use the shutters in a different way. So some windows are open, some windows are closed. They change all the time, and frankly, I think that's more than sufficient. But that's a question. Of course, I also hope that we did a rather elegant facade. It's very difficult to do an elegant facade with floor heights that we have now compared to the past. But we discussed a lot with the developer. We had a decent floor, let's say ceiling heights. So it works. And here, just to please the people. No, it's not just to please the people. This is the other side of the building. It's exactly the same building towards the courtyard, which is not private. It's accessible, but somehow communal, let's say, and in some ways intimate. The apartments open up completely in a series of loggias, balconies, and very large windows. Yes, that's my present part of it.
Thank you, Victorio. I trust that as we progress, it will become less like, you following 3 shows on Netflix at the same time and you're changing channels, and it will come together like a Robert Altman or a Paul Thomas Anderson movie. It will happen. So with the present, I'm really thinking about the time I'm spending here, the 8 weeks. Haven't spent this much time at the GSD since I graduated in 2001. So on top of making sure I hit a list that Sarah gave me that I must do this time around, because I spent so much time in Gund last time around and I missed all these things. Apart from that, one thing I did try to do while I'm in the building is whenever I have time, I go down to the library and I'm trying to go through all the Geoponti books in the Loeb Library. The reason for doing this is because 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit a house that he designed in Hong Kong. Geoponti actually has a few projects in Hong Kong too. One is a department store building that he's designed for a businessman called Daniel Koo, who runs this department store. So he designed a mid-rise building. But a lesser-known project is the residence for Daniel Koo. It was built in the late 60s, and it's rarely been published. There's very little information about it, and I got an opportunity to visit this home, which was amazing. Still, Daniel Koo lives in it. It's pretty much kept to its original design with this very gently sloped roof and these beautiful custom-made ceramic tiles, like this, really like the size of an egg on the facade. So while I was visiting this house, I had digging through the house. When I was in the basement, I came across this model, and it's a model of a house that Joe Ponte designed also for the family, but in the US, in Marin County in California. And it was never built, but I have seen drawings of this house because he did this very provocative series of drawings of the plan of the house based on the brain. So it started with this, and this was the eventual plan of the house. It never got built, but the model is still sitting in the basement somewhere in Hong Kong. Joe Ponte was the founder and editor of Domus in 1928 to 41. He took a break, and in between he was the editor of Lo Stile in 1941 to 47, and then he went back to Domus again as the editor from 48 to his death in 79. Grace also mentioned Victorio was also the editor of Domus from 1992 to 96. Is that right? Yep. So even though Victorio is showing us mostly his built projects today, that's definitely something I'm interested in talking to him about in terms of how, similar to Joe Ponte, that his practice, in addition to built work, his editorial work and his writing is also important. And coming across, this is one of Joe Ponte's books called Amate l'Architettura, in Praise of Architecture, published in 1957. And it's really presented as a collection of ideas, presented in a non-hierarchical way. So the material is quite heterogeneous. It includes pieces he wrote for Domus and Lo Stile. And in a way, it's not important to read it from the beginning to end, that you can kind of dive in, dive out, kind of like a cookbook or a dictionary. In one of the articles he wrote for Lo Stile, it was in the March 1944 issue, titled Invenzione di una architettura composta, Invention of a Composed Architecture. He writes, and I quote, "My character does not possess a natural predisposition for the formulation of principles, the construction of theories, or the rationalization of terms in their totality or frameworks of thought. The development of ideas occurs more often than not by nature. It espouses the versatility of my temperament, manifests itself periodically and via revelation in action." And this translation was done by Massimo Martinoni. And I became interested in his way of kind of nonlinear thinking between his thinking and his working, and this discontinuity between his writing and his works, and also his the scope of works. I mean, mostly here I'm showing building projects, but also, for example, the works he did for Ginori, the ceramics company. That was how he got connected to Daniel Koo and his shop business, which the scope and type of work that Ponte has been involved with also reminds me of Ben Thompson, whose building and the company Design Research is the site and topic of the studio that Victor and I are teaching this semester. It's a place, you're familiar with this building on Brattle Street, a place where architecture, interior, furniture design, food, music, they all have a kind of equal place at the table. And in that way, I think Ponte's search for a language through action, through design, across multiple design disciplines, and it's not done through necessarily building a well-argued narrative. Your future.
Wow. In the 90s, I wrote a little book that is called La modernità della durata. In English, it's modernity and durability. It's not exactly the same because my thesis is that durability is modern, or that to be modern, one has to be durable. It was in some way the beginning of my interest in sustainability, and in what I now consider a rather crude form, but or very limited form. But my argument was that to be somehow responsible in our world, our buildings should last as long as possible, and should not be destroyed after after enough money was made with them in a very shortly, and this meant, of course, also a criticism of at least a part of the modern movement, because at least some of those buildings were deliberately built for a short limit of time, for very good reasons, actually, for very respectable, not good, respectable reasons, and that was to make them as cheap as possible in order that everybody could afford them. But that was, I think we have learned a little bit more. Anyway, the book was received. It was quite a bestseller, the only one that I've written, but was not received very nicely by a lot of people. And Mr. Liebeskind wrote that it was a clearly very proto-fascist book, since I was advocating a solid and resistant architecture. My interest in sustainability has clearly increased, I think, for very obvious reason. I think it's a challenge that we cannot not accept. And I'm interested in finding ways of being sustainable, of being really sustainable, and out of this idea of sustainability, develop a new language. I have to reframe it. I'm not interested in developing a new language, but I believe that if we take sustainability seriously, by necessity, a new architectural language, or somehow new architectural, or maybe a very old, architectural language will emerge. In any case, things would change. I show you now. It's very risky. No, it's because it's really the future. It's something that we are working at, and we don't know if it will really work. For very curious reasons and under very curious circumstances, we are building a campus in Stuttgart. I will spare you the details, in spite of the fact that they are pretty amusing, I think. So this is, let's say, the situation. We create a kind of piazza in the middle. It's a business center. It's offices. This is, let's say, this is the master plan as we envisage it in a final stage. But of course, this will happen very slowly. And now this is the situation. There is the big building that you see on the left is not very beautiful, but working production building that we have kept and transformed into a restaurant and some offices. Now they want to build. So 2 buildings are built, and they want to build there where the parking lot is. So in the middle of more or less in the middle of the campus, a new building, and this is this red building that I show you. This is what is there. Is 2 buildings made of bricks of clinker, pretty simple. Why doesn't it work? Go on. Can we do this maybe? It doesn't move forward. Thank you. And for this new building, this is the floor plan of the new building. We are making an experiment. I was interested in using stone as a load bearing structure. So not just as a let's say as a self-sustaining facade, which we did already, but really as the structure. Of course, I was interested. I looked at Pouillon, who did it. He did it with stone blocks. We are trying to do it really using columns made of stone. So this would be the floor plan. The big columns that you see are columns made of stone. When I proposed this to our engineer, he told me that I was completely crazy and that it would never work. Then he called me up a day later and said he had looked into it a little bit more precisely, and he thinks it would work, and it would even be pretty simple if we use concrete plates, floor plates, and stone columns that shouldn't be higher than 3.5 meters, which is okay, I think. We have 3.80 meters, but it's okay. So this was the floor plan, or this are the two floor plans. These were the references. This is an Egyptian temple where you see that stone is really used as a real structure. And now I'm mixing up things a little bit because this is a model that we did for another building, following in somehow the same system. We did it on the one hand to convince the client, but also on the other hand to convince ourselves that it would work. It's really made of stone, so the columns are stone, and also in the model, and the floor plates are concrete, also in the model. There are issues with insulation, of course. Pouillon did not have these issues, but it's pretty cold in his buildings, so in our case, in this building, we decided to have the structure that I just mentioned, to use all these very simple columns and floor plates, to have a stair. I'm very interested in stairs, I admit. To have a stair as a connection of the floors, but also as a place of encounter and communication, and then to put a glass facade all around it, so that the columns are protected, but can be viewed from 360 degrees from all sides. That was important. In the ground floor, we do exactly the contrary. We leave the stones out, and the facade is it. But the facade never touches the stone, because otherwise you would have to put the insulation there, and you would not see the stone. And the stone becomes. We are testing it. We are really, literally, and we're doing it right now. We're testing how it could look. So this would be the let's say the theme of the stone columns. The stair should really be a kind of labyrinthic element, like in Piranesi. So it starts on the ground and then becomes something very very complex. In a way, a contrast to this basically totally simple building. It's a loft. We're doing a loft, also because we don't know, or at least I believe that we don't know, what an office building in 5 years, 4 years will be. And this is, let's say, a first idea of how the interior could look. So the stones really, the stone columns really become a major presence also in this interiors, and can you move just one further on? Yeah, thank you. And this is how we imagine this building to look like. We're thinking of a sandstone, of a rather strong sandstone that brings also a little bit of color into this building. But the real idea is to to have a building that is made of elements that, let's say, energetically or in terms of CO2, cost practically nothing. If they are cut, as long as you cut them in the quarry and don't fuss around with them anymore. I mean, if you start to change the surface and to modify it, it becomes expensive, both in terms of money and in terms of energy. But if you use them raw, and I would like to have them raw, then they are pretty cheap. Actually, they cost less than concrete columns, and energetically okay. Moreover, you could reuse them. I mean, this is a fantasy that I always have, that these elements can be reused, like like the Roman columns were reused in the first Christian basilica in Rome, or in the Great Mosque in Cordoba, and I think that, I mean, this is just, it's an experiment. We don't know if we will succeed. It's only one way to do it, but it encourages me in thinking that if we take the responsibility that we have towards our world really seriously, we can also make good architecture. This is my future.
Thank you, Victorio. So one of the things is always that the future is closer than we think. And I know I cheated when I talked about the present. My present is looking at the past and thinking about Gio Ponti's work, which, when I was looking through the books, I found this library card in one of the books. And you'll see in the middle, very faint, is Jeannie Gang from 1992, of which I asked Mark to send her the picture. And I think she also thought, wow, like that went by really quickly, from the time that she checked out the book to now. And in terms of these kind of overlapping histories and overlapping paths, and having this conversation, which I think is important. And what I'm kind of thinking about as our module studios are coming to close and leaving here is also thinking about how to come back. Because of this opportunity, such as this series Positions, to be able to engage in conversation, this is a slide from a talk that Neil Denari gave, where he says, you're always somewhere with someone. In terms of kind of finding your tribe, finding your group or your cult, whatever you want to call it. He parses this out in different ways. But how these conversations, at least for me, is not necessarily about solidifying positions, but an opportunity to have distance from the work and gain new perspective and insight into my own work. And I think my projection is that Ponti's involvement with these different magazines or different project designs are also ways in which he frames his thinking through different modes of design. While I was doing this research, one of my favorite quotes is in Amate l'Architettura, and I quote, I learned it from Adolf Loos, whom I knew personally. The legs of a chair or furniture, he told me, should always be slightly too thin, a pinnacle always slightly too high, a bridge also slightly too taut, always a challenge. Which I thought it's interesting that the greatest challenge that was posed by him came from Adolf Loos. And, in terms of how to push the envelope, to go just a little bit too far from his comfort zone. And I think these conversations and also the opportunity how Victor and I have had these kind of paths that cross at different points have allowed us to ask those questions of each other.
So I will end by showing you several images of, and intentionally fragments of things that are probably beginning to help answer the question for ourselves and myself about position. One of the things that I found I'd never actually thought about position before. I'd never thought about my work or our work or Vittorio's work relative to another. And perhaps that's a privilege that I myself have not afforded to me. That has been something that I have been too busy distracting myself with other things. So I appreciate this moment to begin to start to think about that with regard to the discipline, the academy, and the profession. One of the things that I find most compelling is this notion that seems to be pervasive throughout the entire past, present, and future, is this consideration of embracing anxiety. And I think this is a snippet, one image of many images of a project for the Tech Crema Art Center in New Orleans, a project that was included as part of the publication Inscriptions by Andrew Holder and K. Michael Hayes, and really began to help understand that there were ideas that were percolating, ideas that were not in direct confrontation with the discipline, ideas that didn't necessarily align themselves directly and explicitly with identity politics, but that began to offer a certain degree of embracing, an embrace of anxiety. In this particular instance, that anxiety is the considering the kind of urban and cityscape of New Orleans, a city that whose roots are deep in commerce, but also in colonial traditions of the shotgun and the kind of Caribbean architectures, vernaculars that make up most of its domestic landscape. The idea that these two frames of mind, or two ways of thinking formally, could collide, could coexist or combine with one another to produce a notion of ambivalent form that is neither one or the other, I think is something that begins to talk about the idea of positioning. I think it is also possibly something that Clover and I both share. Another kind of key element for me was the writing of an article for the emerging practice current interest. And what drew me to their work and to the decision to write this piece was that, unlike many practices that are currently active, that are taking on the challenge of including voices from individuals and communities that have often not been part of the conversation, is that they, in my mind, as designers and thinkers, are very interested in constructing dialogue. So rather than being an affrontment to the discipline and to the canon, it is about turning up the volume and making, growing the conversation to even a louder crescendo, where issues that involve all sorts of cultural references, all sorts of cultural interest and formal, I would say, the way that we think about the richness of the discipline is through the accumulation of things. And that was something that drew me quite closely to this. So it, for me, began to, and I think that Inscriptions does a much better job of this, but beginning to talk about the expanded field of creative expression. On our ride over here today, Clover and I were talking about the discipline that we were educated in and how that discipline didn't allow for one's identity to be infused in the creative process, that they were two separate entities. Who you were and what you designed were not one and of the same thing. But I think that as we begin to understand the power of conversation, just as Vittorio has mentioned with his friendship and collaboration with Grassi, that these are inspiring and empowering moments. They are the opportunity to begin to understand one's place in that field. That is not in direct confrontation, but in collaboration with. The work of current interest made it possible for me to understand that. The last is to contemplate a project that is forthcoming, something that is too fetal to show, but that begins to talk about this idea of positioning, which is the design of artist residence for the Neuropurifoy Foundation for the Outdoor Museum in Joshua Tree. Just as Neuropurifoy had left the city in order to find freedom and a kind of open-endedness to expression using the desert landscape to create without interruption. I think that where we are going with the conversations, particularly those that are percolating in this institution, are beginning to lay the foundation for a much richer set of conversations that are not in direct competition with each other, but that are producing a certain cosmopolitanism, and that incite more conversation, as we're having today, and new associations. Thank you. So, just one last thing. We intentionally decided not to show work of ours together, but we're showing this slide of our shadows in the construction of a project that we recently completed in Alpine, Wyoming. How did we do with time?
She didn't ever raise her hand once.
What?
We have like 15 minutes to talk. It's 1:40. No, it was great. Thank you. So, do you want to ask each other things first before we open it to the floor? I don't want to, because you haven't actually rehearsed. I mean, you haven't seen each other. You didn't know what you were going to share today.
No.
No.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I guess this is more of a technical question, but I did want to hear more about the stone columns in terms of, how are they actually solid blocks that are stacked on top of each other with what is between them, and what is the technology of construction, and how you mentioned that not treating them, so it's okay not to treat them whether or not they're inside or outside?
Yes. It's okay if the stone is solid enough. We are now in the process of deciding which stone can resist, low temperatures and things like that. But normally, yes, stone is quite solid. The details also we are in the process of developing them. But basically, it's very simple because it's a block of stone that stands up because it's so big. Also, of course, the developer don't like it because you take away surface, but it's not that dramatic. And basically, when a stone meets the slab, the concrete slab, you only need some steel detail that holds it in place. But the whole thing works with pressure, with nothing else. And of course, you have to make the whole system rigid, but that's true for every structure with the core of the stairs or the elevators.
I was curious about the detail because partially, when you showed it in the first series of images, it looked almost like just a wireframe of a computer model. like a kind of the initial idea. And there's this kind of muted quality to the columns that when you then showed a later rendering of it where there's people, there are tables and chairs, you get the quality of the glass, the reflectivity, the columns remain almost the same as the very, very initial kind of line, simple drawing that has this kind of mutedness to it. So I thought it was interesting that, through the development and articulation of all the things around, it almost seemed like the stone column has this stillness and muteness to it. So I was curious just about in terms of the tectonics, articulation, like is it about hiding all of those details, that it stays kind of still where everything moves around it?
No, thank you for the question. We'll see, but it's not my interest to hide the details. I mean, if we discover that we really need, which is possible, a kind of steel plate between the stone and the concrete, well, we will show it.
No, you go. Sarah, you go first.
No, so I mean that actually, I think that muteness is a good segue to the question I wanted to ask, and I want to thank all three of you. It was very enlightening, very interesting, and also entertaining, which is a good combination for this space and this series. Now, I wanted to get to expression, which was something that you put on the table, Vittorio, and you talked about that you had agreed, the three of you, that would be part of what was holding the talks together. And so expression is a term that talks about one's personal subjectivity, a term that came up a little bit in your presentation, Vittorio, and I think was more explicit when you were speaking, Victor. I suddenly am realizing that you're surrounded by the Vittorio Clover.
Sandwich.
Your sandwich, yeah. But if you can maybe, after having done the presentation, speak to expression a little more explicitly, because I think you dodged a little bit, Vittorio, the idea that expression is architectural or expression is subjective, and it sort of becomes both. And I think the muted columns actually are part of the discussion of what is happening with expression with your work. And Victor, I'm curious with expression being, you speak of it both in terms of personal expression and personal experience, but also a kind of tribe or collective expression. And to what extent is that possible today without becoming fashion? And so if you can all speak to expression as you promised you would.
Victor, you go first.
In my mind, found great comfort in Vittorio's determination to advocate for longevity for building. I thought it was something that I had actually never will have the privilege of aspiring to, given the economic realities, given the context in which we build in this country. And I found it admirable that we were looking at projects who persisted with the ambition of having buildings last beyond one's life, or pieces of those buildings as if they were spolia finding themselves in new context. In terms of, I think embracing this anxiety, and probably the most important thing is in this context at the GSD is being surrounded by so many ambitious and intelligent students who are asking themselves the very question of how do I harness my place in the discipline? How do I practice? How do I begin to make significant contributions to the practice? I think it's something that I share with them. There is the difference of age, of course, but there is that anxiety of being somewhat feeling a certain degree of impotence in terms of what potentials there are. I think the idea of fashion in the work comes purely out of, for the moment, a certain degree of resignation about what opportunities are afforded to certain people, and making the best of those situations. I imagine that, and that is both a conscious decision, but also the reaction to what, and perhaps this is where the therapy comes in, that it's an imposed reality. So I think that it's this idea of ephemera, in contrast to your idea of permanence, is really about context, about the realities of a social democratic culture in Europe as opposed to the free market in the United States.
I mean, I just want to add to that in terms of I'm not surprised that Victor, the kind of sentiment that it solicits from you is anxiety. I think for me, it's actually productive and it's maybe more positive, and it's less of a kind of negative sentiment. I think there's a kind of fundamental belief that the language of architecture comes from, the craft. I think the commitment to building and how that we kind of went to school and practiced in a generation where certain of our identities are suppressed. And, for me, I think it tends to emerge more in the kind of narrative part of the work versus the language, which I think that is also something that is not always in sync and not always, working together. But I'm trying to, or I guess I don't feel the kind of anxiety from it. I think it's actually can be productive and positive.
Maybe I should note that I consider that anxiety to be a vehicle of creative activity. I think that it was Dave Hickey in that semester that we were together that said, I really can't stand Santa Fe because everything is so relaxed. And the reason I love New York and Los Angeles is because there's just so much damn anxiety. And I think that anxiety breeds a certain degree of consciousness and clarity of thought in ways, and I think, yes, it can be consuming and paralyzing, but I also think that it can be something that offers opportunity. Putting yourself forward when in doubt is probably better than not. So.
Don't run from fear.
Don't run from fear.
Fun from
rear.
Sarah stole the word that was on the tip of my tongue, expression. So I want to maybe ask a set of questions around that same idea, but from a slightly different vantage. So I'm kind of wondering, with respect to expression, have you guys maybe switched places? So Vittorio presented a kind of a narrative of continuity, where there is this kind of consistent interest in an urban scale muteness. But maybe if we look very closely, there is a transformation happening from the kind of mute exteriors of Los that allow us to have the kind of inside-outside dualism, because the exterior could be made of paint, foam core. It's like profoundly agnostic in terms of its material presence. When we move forward to the stone column building, there all of a sudden, at least at the base, the exterior expression is kind of coincident with the interior, because we're using this monolithic material, and so like its rawness all of a sudden becomes exactly like Karnak, the image of the sort of Egyptian ruin that you were showing. And that seems like a kind of profound bringing into alignment of like hidden systems of order with like exterior expression and experience. And then for Victor and Clover, sort of you started with projects that
as you put it, are kind of scratching at the surface of an individual's sort of expressive potential, like what's happening with that person who's walking around the Ramble sort of late at night. And then you end with the kind of flat field of the desert that can be populated with sort of any piece, or like a radical flattening. So no matter how expressive the individual piece, we're now finding solace or like a release from anxiety because they all just sit on this kind of infinite flat plane that can absorb any degree of pluralism, maybe without a lot of effort or difficulty. But just again, to kind of put pressure on that question of like, well, how much is the individual allowed to be kind of aesthetically like loud? And is there a kind of amazing switching sides of the restrained sort of Marxist impulse with the American sort of like liberal impulse?
So how would you have us sit? Did you ask us to change seats?
Well, I think the two victors should switch sides, but you should stay in the middle. Yeah.
As long as you're in the
As
middle.
long as I don't have to move, it's okay.
I do think the grass is always greener on the other side. I would start by saying that I think in the kind of maniacal like context of the American experience, one finds a degree of fatigue in the kind of this notion or this illusion of freedom. There is a certain kind of romantic affiliation with the social democratic project and its muteness and its ability to command the material in ways that that luxury is just not afforded on this side of the water. So I think that what you're sensing is perhaps just envy. To go back to an earlier statement at the beginning of the semester. That there's a degree of envy in terms of scale of project, impact of project, expanse of the project, and the levels of design inquiry within those projects that I think that I personally haven't yet to experience on this side.
After you.
Can I just bring up, in terms of geography, we do span 3 continents. And just thinking about this idea of expression and you know, because both Gio Ponti's project in Hong Kong are pretty much unknown. Even the mid-rise project, which is 10 stories high in the most busy street in Hong Kong, how it's also very different from the Pirelli Tower because it's not freestanding, it's sandwiched between 2 buildings, so what you really experience is just the facade. It's been sold since the company folded, and it was sold to the company that owns Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So you can imagine what happened to the facade. They put this really funky lighting on. And then the house, on the other hand, actually, it was a very sad story, but the owner, Daniel Koo, and his wife, somebody broke into the house, they were robbed and tied up, and they became very paranoid, and so for many, many years wouldn't allow any visitors, friends to visit. So both of these projects are, because of their context, I think also really kind of dialed down and muted also. So in terms of, you know, I should have tried to find a picture of the mid-rise tower that he did in terms of, like, there's this whole layer that's been put on top of it now that it barely shows through in terms of his design.
I'm not sure this is on, but you showed a slide early on of, I think it was an apartment building in Switzerland, where you were talking about the shutters on the street side, and then on the back side was an open common area with all the balconies facing the common area. And I was wondering what you thought was distinctive about that building. How was it different from just a standard apartment building?
It wasn't. It's not different from a standard apartment building. It's just done a little bit nicely. But I'm not interested at all in being distinctive. This is really my last interest. On the contrary, I would advocate, let's say, a kind of a positive normality or a radical normality for architecture.
What made it better in your opinion?
Yes, for but not just that. But I think that the details, the shutters, the plans of the apartment, the size of the courtyard, the way the courtyard is designed, how the balconies relate to the courtyard, is, if I may say so, quite good. In any case, it was a big after the marketing guys of the developer for whom we built it said that they would not be able to rent one single apartment in such a complex. It ended up to being the greatest success for the developer at large. So I would say that's a good sign, because I'm quite interested in how people react to the buildings.
I would like you to respond when you shut your lips after Victor made his comment about the envy of the European continent's capacity to articulate in the way that you are something that is not evidently conspicuous. It's a kind of radical normality in this context of extreme heterogeneity, architectural heterogeneity, building after building difference, which is the current condition of contemporary architecture in America, in this country. What would you do in this country? What is your diagnosis for this? If you look at any of the cities, I mean, it's not only the United States. Take a city like Toronto, which is just rampant heterogeneity. Sorry, that too.
Freud would love you.
That's true. The two types of Go ahead.
I totally agree. No, I have no diagnosis for America, clearly, and I close my lips only to leave the word to Clover. No, I do have an answer, and the answer is, don't think that the situations are that different. I mean, they are different simply because Switzerland is a kind of happy island for architects. I have to admit that we are well paid, so that allows us to, for instance, to pay our people decently, which is impossible in Italy. You can't do that. Which is, I think, dramatic. And it allows us also to do a little research, not much, but a little research, which is, let's say, my aim. I mean, that's why I design. If I had to design just, what I know, then I think I would change profession. It's not, but still, it's not that different. I mean, you do have to fight against the developers, and developers have a tendency that is very similar to that in the US, probably on another level of drama, let's say, but it's not that different, I think, and the question of resistance of us architects resisting to what we are asked to do, and to, let's say, to change these requests in something that is positive, is true, I think, in every other country. But besides the fact that we're not social democrats, Switzerland, well, I don't know exactly what it is, but we are proud to be a fascist country now. So it's a different. No, it's clearly ironical, but let's say also the political situation is not easy at all.
I wish we had time for more. It's actually 2:00, so I know that classes are starting and everyone has to get on. But I'm really grateful to the way that you three orchestrated the conversation today, because it was actually I learned so much about what is in your head. And to me, it's really clarifying, I mean, from the pedagogical value of this, to see the lineage, where you were, what influences and impacts you've had, and then to see this play out. So it might not have been very obvious to you three, as you're working it through real time, but I think for us, it's actually incredibly interesting and clarifying, because I feel like we know so much more about what you are, your architecture and your interests in the discipline. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.